Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Molly Marin. I'm the webinar coordinator for the New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center. Just a few reminders before we get started today. We have several upcoming professional development opportunities, including 2 more webinars in today's webinar strand. More information and registration information is available on our webpage at nysrti.org. Also, a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation is posted on our webpage. Just where you register for the webinars, it's under Professional Development and under Webinars. At the end of today's presentation, we will post a link to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a few minutes to respond to that, we would appreciate it. During today's presentation, please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have. We are very pleased to have Dr. Sylvia Linnon-Thompson with us today to present our Strand 11 series, Culturally Responsive Instruction and Assessment for English Language Learners in an RTI Model. Today's topic is Culturally Responsive RTI. Dr. Sylvia Linnon-Thompson is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research interests include examining appropriate instructional and assessment practices for English language learners, particularly those related to the acquisition of reading skills and the implementation of RTI. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Linnon-Thompson.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. I'm going to take that as a yes. As Molly mentioned, this is the first of 3 webinar series that will look at culturally responsive RTI. So today's session is going to be an overview of what that is, and then the next 2 sessions will go more deeply into both assessment and instruction. I'd like to acknowledge the Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. They funded 3 model demonstration projects looking specifically at the implementation of RTI in schools with large numbers of English language learners, and we have one of those projects. So for the last 3 years, we've been looking at this topic in 3 different schools here in the Central Texas area, and just the list there are the number of the other members of our team that have been working on this project. So today we're going to cover 3 topics. First, we're going to talk about what a culturally responsive RTI is and isn't. Briefly talk about the benefits and challenges of RTI, and then at some of the factors or some of the practices that need to be in place to create the context for culturally responsive RTI. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if you have something pressing, you can feel free to send the question in the chat box. So just to get started so I know who you guys are, can you just say which of those roles you have, whether you're a classroom teacher, an ESL teacher, an interventionist, special education teacher, or administrator? Okay, so it looks like it's mostly ESL teachers and some interventionists and an administrator. Well, this is perfect because the ESL teacher and the interventionist are 2 of the critical people in administering culturally responsive RTI. Okay, so we can get going. So culturally responsive RTI, what it is and what it isn't. Well, the way we have been defining culturally, and we have added the linguistically part because we are working in dual language schools, but the way we've defined culturally and linguistically responsive response to intervention, the main thing is, the goal is to ensure that no group of students is over or underrepresented in supplemental or intensive interventions. And we think this is a critical distinction because for many years, especially when we first started implementing RtI nationally, the idea was that it was okay if English language learners were overrepresented in Tier 2 because they were getting the instruction that they needed. And, I'll admit that I was one of those people that thought, well, that's what the data shows and it's not a bad placement for them. But one of the things that we've seen as time has gone on is that when we place students into Tier 2 that don't need to be there, they're really missing out on the language and, more of the higher order skills that they sometimes need. So we really want to make sure that they are not overrepresented even in Tier 2. And we want to ensure that ELLs are properly instructed in each tier. So that, and we'll talk a little bit more of that, but basically we want to make sure that it's appropriate in terms of language, in terms of rigor, in terms of the content that they get. And finally, that it takes into account the many factors that can impact student performance, progress and scores on screening and progress monitoring measures. So this is the part that particularly speaks to assessment. So some of the factors include changes in English and native language proficiency and literacy skills over time. We are still not doing a very good job at looking at how those two things work together. And part of it is that we still don't have really good data that tells us, well, what is normal development if you're learning in your second language, and what is not normal, right? What is below average and should be an indication of concern. And we also sometimes fail to take into account the quality, quantity, and features of prior educational experience. And I think this is really critical if you're in an area or in a district where there's a high student mobility, right? Because that's fairly easy to do if the students are with you, over time from kindergarten on or first grade on. But when you have students coming in and out, that's a little bit harder to determine. And then the last thing is imprecise and or biased assessment instruments. We have, in our work in these last 3 years, have run across settings where there isn't good alignment of measures over time, or where, for example, we still have the case now in one school where the students seem to be doing well in kindergarten, first, second grade when they're being assessed in Spanish, but then in third grade they're assessed in English, and then of course a large number of students are now eligible for Tier 2. When, from looking at the data over time, we can see that it's probably only due to language, but just the structure of the district still places them in Tier 2. So, still trying to figure out the best way to deal with those kinds of challenges, especially in districts that set policy at the district level for the majority of their students and set benchmarks for the majority of their students, and don't take into account CLD students that might have different trajectories but don't need Tier 2. So those are some of the topics that we'll be covering in this set of webinars. So here is the RtI framework that everybody knows. We have the universal screening and at the beginning, middle, end of the year, and the movement between tiers that we are all familiar with. And one of the things that the model demonstration projects, we all agree that we don't think that RTI for CLD students is a completely different thing, that it's not a separate process that you have to run parallel to your current RTI. It's not, something that is, completely different. But rather we think that, it's in this problem-solving area where you really nuance the RTI process so that it benefits CLD students, right? So it's still just one model, one framework that needs to expand a little bit to be effective for CLD students. So I have another question here because how you answer this will help me determine sort of how I frame the rest of the presentation. So what kind of bilingual programs do you have in your schools? Okay, well, it looks like the majority are ESL programs and a few bilingual programs, either dual language or transitional, or students that are just served within the general population. Okay, so that's helpful to know. Okay, so one of the things that I think it's important to note and be clear about is that RTI is not a substitution for ESL. Even when you're doing culturally responsive RTI, students still need to be served with English as a second language programs. And the main reason for that is that they are serving different, their purposes are different, and they serve different populations. So as you all know, English as a second language program are for students who have limited English proficiency. And the response to instruction program is for students who are experiencing learning difficulties. Now, it's possible that a student who is an English language learner has difficulty with learning, but they should still, it's not all students. So if their difficulty is due to language, they wouldn't be, RTI wouldn't be appropriate. And those two programs will be parallel programs, right? So ESL has qualification criteria, prescriptive instruction, and its own exit criteria, as does RTI. So when we talk about culturally responsive RTI, we're talking about how we enhance the core instruction, how we make sure tiers 2 and 3 are appropriate for English language learners. But that doesn't mean that students then wouldn't receive ESL if that is one of the programs offered in the schools, or if that's the means that the school has for ensuring their second language development. So if we look at differences in the programs, and some of the things that we know in terms of reading, we know, for example, that most reading programs focus on building reading skills. And, most of the mainstream basal programs assume a certain level of English language skills, right? They teach phonics in first grade, some into second grade. But if you were in a Spanish program in first grade, you didn't get that. So if you all of a sudden are in an English program in second grade, the assumption is that you had all that phonics instruction in first grade, and you might have had phonics instruction in first grade, but it was in Spanish. It wasn't in English. So we have to take that into consideration. And there's also not enough emphasis on building language proficiency, in particular academic language, in most reading programs. And students need access to expository text to build disciplinary knowledge. That is better addressed now with Common Core, but still it's something that we should keep in mind. So when you're thinking about your students that are English language learners, then and where they would get support, you can think about ESL or ELD development, the ELD class, as that is the place that provides the foundation for English language learning, right, for English learning. And then in Tier 1 or Tier 2, that is the area where their language skills are scaffolded so that they can access the content, right? So they still have very distinct purposes in terms of helping English language learners become proficient in reading and in their language use. So here you have how we have conceptualized our culturally responsive RtI, and we just call it RtI Plus. And so you can see that, there's still core instruction, and the boxes are underneath are the ways in which we have seen schools and helped schools enhance RtI so it's more effective for English language learners. So the first one is that reading instruction takes into account the features of the student's first language. And we'll talk about this more in the session on instruction. But for example, just when we think about phonics instruction, if you have students that come from a language have a language background like Arabic or Nepali or, Chinese, those children have different scripts. If they're coming to you in kindergarten and they maybe haven't had a lot of exposure to literacy, it may not be an issue. But when they're a little bit older and if they have some literacy background, it might take them longer to learn the alphabet, our alphabet, because it's a completely different script. In addition, in some of those languages, the basic unit is a syllable or a word, and they have to get around the idea that our syllables represent individual sounds. So just thinking about those kinds of things, I think, is helpful in planning instruction and how long it might take a child to learn even some of those basic foundational skills. The other part is the focus on all four communicative domains. There's a lot of evidence, for example, in the newest practice guide, researcher practice guide, that we really need to focus more on oral language and writing, because both of those are productive skills and develop students' productive language skills, and that is really important if we're going to get to comprehension, right? Across a number of studies, we know that we've gotten much better at helping students develop phonics and the basic foundational skills, but many students still struggle with comprehension, and that, of course, is related to language. The next part is related to the first point, which is leverage language knowledge. One of the things we know about bilingual children is that they develop metalinguistic awareness at much higher levels than monolingual students. And, it makes sense because if you're bilingual, you have to think about language a lot more than somebody that's monolingual, right? Because you have to figure out, well, how's different from the other language I know? You know, how can I compare it? How can I help learn this? And that's something that I don't think we have done in the past a very good job at helping children recognize that they have this metalinguistic knowledge and how to use it. So, you know, how do we help them make better use of that resource in the classroom? And then finally, build academic and content vocabulary. I know we say this a lot, but I think a lot of times we tend to focus with ELLs in particular on building just the foundational skills, and that's important. I'm like, you know, it is, you know, and that's something that can happen in ESL, but the other part we have to remember is in the core classroom is exposure, right? I mean, if we, again, think about just exposure to language, if they hear the language, and if we're supporting that in Tier 1 instruction, then that's going to give them the opportunity to say, oh, at least I've heard that word before. So, again, those are things we'll talk about more when we talk about instruction. Then the next part of it is database decision making. Again, a common, typical part of RTI, you know, but how does it differ? How will you make decisions differently if your students are ELLs? And then the first thing, and again, I know this isn't new because this is something that everybody's been talking about, is using students' language proficiency, cultural background, and educational histories to inform decisions. And I think that especially the language proficiency and their histories are critical in those beginning of the year data, the decision-making meetings that you have to place students in Tier 2 after you do your screening. Again, if they're new to your district, if they're new to your school, you know, those might be more important. I don't know if some of you might be using, for example, dynamic assessment to do sort of quick assessments of students to see if it's just a lack of experience or if they really have difficulty learning. And then the second part of that is language development is monitored. And that's something that we've been working on quite a bit, and part of it has to do, as I know many of you also know, is that it's challenging to monitor language development for a lot of reasons. You know, it's not easy, for example, to take oral samples or to assess students on a lot of the sub-skills. So we've been, for example, working on writing as a means to track student language development, and it's something that teachers do anyway. And, you know, we have been working to try to identify the most predictive factors in a student writing. For example, is it spelling? Is it the number of words? Is it the number of unique words? And we'll talk again more about that when we talk about assessment. And then finally, for supplemental instruction, Tiers 2 and 3, it's many of the same things as Tier 1, right? So how many of these you know, building the language and helping students leverage what they know. So as you can see, it really doesn't have to be or isn't a completely separate process. It's just what you do within the system that you already have. So just to summarize this part, so, you know, when we think about high quality instruction for CLD students, it's everything else that we would normally do. It, you know, apply higher order thinking to key disciplinary areas, deliberately structured productive collaboration, rigorous and coherent content, knowledge, and application, and then language, academic language, and disciplinary literacy. Particularly as students start to get older, disciplinary literacy, knowing and recognizing all those different genres becomes critical. Any questions at this point? Okay. So the benefits and the challenges. So when we talk about the benefits, again, the benefits for ELLs and students from culturally linguistically diverse backgrounds are the same as they are for everybody, right? It incorporates prevention and early intervention, in order to ensure that students don't get far behind, so that it will be easier for them to catch up, particularly if the challenge is lack of exposure, lack of experience with the tasks, with literacy. And then the second part is multiple tasks and opportunities over time to demonstrate that they're learning. And, all of these things together, increase our confidence in the referral process, right? Because if we've followed all the steps of RTI, we can assume, or we can have more confidence that if a student has failed to learn, given all the support that we've talked about and all the opportunities, then, that would be indicative of the fact that they really do have a learning difficulty or disability, and they're not just casualties of inappropriate or inadequate instruction. But as I mentioned at the beginning, there are several challenges still. There's still no clear guidelines in the transition from one language to another. So just because you are making good progress in your home language, if we're not also early on paying attention to your English language development, you're likely to have difficulty when you transition to English-only instruction. So part of it is, again, how does ESL and, core instruction, how do they work together to make sure that students are not only developing the literacy skills that they need, but that they are also developing the language that they're going to need, the level of language they're going to need to be successful. We still, again, do not address the time needed to develop language skills. And as all of you know, some children seem to develop skills very quickly, while others take more time. Sometimes it's not related to even their scores. Some children, so there's a lot of variability between literacy and language skills. So even though, for example, we know that as a group, students that have higher levels of English proficiency also tend to have higher levels of literacy skills. That is, when we get to the individual children, that doesn't always hold, right? So some children have high literacy skills and lower language skills. Some students seem to have great language skills and lower literacy skills. And so one question you might ask yourself is, well, if they have great language skills and lower literacy skills, wouldn't that be an indication that maybe they do have a reading disability? And I would say that, that it's more likely, but that we don't know if that's going to be true for every single child, right? If you see that pattern repeat, like if they're getting good literacy instruction and their progress monitoring is flat or not, they're not progressing at a good rate, then that would be an indication. But the inverse isn't true, right? So they might have high literacy or okay literacy skills in low language. They might have a language difficulty, but obviously not a literacy. And we also lack the definitive answers for practical significance of benchmarks. That is related to the previous one. Is like, just because they're below now, does that mean they're not going to catch up? Or is it the case, because they are learning language as a second language, that, once their language skills have to hit a threshold before then the literacy really takes off? So one of the things, for example, that we're looking at with our data is whether that is the case, that, they do eventually catch up, but it just takes a little bit longer because they're building the English in that, in the first couple of years. And then the last part is getting adequate data. So what can we do to create the context for culturally responsive RtI. So what I started out saying is rather than have two parallel RtI systems, determine how the two will work together. The things we've talked about, consider data in light of students' language proficiency and their opportunities to learn. I know many of you responded that you have ESL programs. So, but within an ESL program, there's still opportunities if there's the resources or the personnel to assess children in their first language, especially when they first arrive or they first enter the system, to get a sense of what their knowledge is in their first language. If that's not available, then that's like one less resource you have, and then you really just have to pay more attention at their rate of learning. Consider the norming sample of assessments used. I think as the populations become more and more diverse and, we get students from more and more different language backgrounds, many of those students or those languages aren't part of our norming sample. There's as more and more children come from Africa who speak, their tribal languages rather than the societal language. We just don't have that information. So obviously we have to use the assessments that we have, but take that into consideration. The next part is consider with whom the interventions have been validated. I would say that in terms of what to teach, in terms of the components of reading, I think that, even if the interventions haven't been validated with those particular groups, that it's important to teach those things. The difference is going to come in how much time you spend on each of the components. So as I mentioned before, if it's a student whose language has a phonological system that's completely different than English, those students might need more time getting used to those, to the sounds of English. They might need to get more used. They might need more time just learning, the letters. Even students that have our same alphabet, they might need more time learning which letter combinations are valid and which aren't. So that phonics part is really critical for all English learners regardless of the language, but it just might be some variability in what you emphasize and for how long. And then consider the language proficiency of students. It comes up all the time, and I know it seems rather trite after a while, but really it just makes such a difference to not, if we don't consider it. This, again, is from the model demonstration across all three sites, that, the things that have come up. And here, the first one, access to high-quality core and supplemental language and literacy instruction. That has become, or one of the reasons that we are still putting a lot of emphasis on this is for the reasons that we mentioned. On the one hand, even though many core reading programs are strong now, from experience we know that they're not always implemented, that teachers don't always use the core program, and when that happens, children like ELLs and the CLD students who need sort of that very systematic introduction to the language and to reading don't get it. We have also found that in bilingual programs that some of the Spanish programs aren't as strong as the English programs, or it's the same case that teachers don't use them. And so then students aren't getting systematic instruction that builds foundational skills, right? So again, if we're going back to, well, have they had good instruction? Part of it, whether it's in English or in their first language, part of it is, were programs used or was instruction delivered in such a way that they had the opportunity to build those foundational skills systematically. Because if they haven't, then it's not going to, they're going to have gaps. The second part of that is the ESL part. Have they had, strong, systematic English phonics and reading instruction, either while they were having their first language instruction or the second? Because, again, we can't assume that they're going to transfer from one language to the other. Some will. High-achieving students almost always will do that. But the children that we're talking about, those are the students that need to either say, here's what you know in Spanish, here's how it works in English, right, and help them transfer that. Or leverage, you already know that, here's how it works in English. Those kinds of things have to be deliberate and they have to be explicit. And that's something that we don't see in a lot of classrooms. There's a lot of assumption that when children come into English that they are somehow going to be able to do that on their own. And that's the piece, that leveraging and that explicit help in transferring what you know is something that's not part of core instruction, because only this subgroup of children needs that kind of instruction. And again, also the focus on language development, which a lot of it can happen in ESL, but the sort of higher level language, the interactions in the core classroom and even in the supplemental instruction, that is also critical there. The availability of assessments and instructional materials. We've talked about assessments quite a bit, but the instructional materials is the second part of it, right? So again, do teachers have enough materials? Again, one of the things, for example, that we've seen a lot in core instruction is that there isn't parallel materials for bilingual students as there are in English. So, we've been in teacher planning meetings where they say, oh, well, we'll use this video, or we'll use this to anchor instruction or introduce. The problem is that that video is only in English, and so the teachers have to show it without the sound and sort of narrate themselves. Or, the language is such that an ELL student won't be able to access it without the teacher preparing them in some way, or, giving some kind of instruction. So those are some of the things that we're talking about. The accuracy of the screening and progress monitoring tools we've talked about. The appropriate use and interpretation of data, again, is something that we spend quite a bit of time with the schools that we're working in terms of helping them, take all those other factors into account when they interpret the data and make decisions about who's going to be Tier 2 and who do they think maybe just needs more support as part of Core 1, right? So making that distinction between, okay, for whom is this just a language issue and they're already in ESL, and if we scaffold them correctly in Tier 1, they're going to be okay. They're going to learn, and they're going to learn at an appropriate rate, and who really is not showing that ability to benefit from Tier 1, right? So when we're talking about ELLs and CLD in particular, that's kind of what it becomes, right? It's not just, so rate of learning is critical, right? That's the main variable that's going to tell us whether these children are able to learn, right? If you know what quality of instruction they're getting, and if the other children in the class are making progress, and 2 or 3 students continue to lag behind and not make progress, that is important. But then factor in the language is like, well, do they have lower language skills than the other students? If that's the case, then maybe we do need to give them more time, right? So it's a matter of layering the different factors to determine whether the child really needs more instruction, a Tier 2 type of instruction, or if they really are going to benefit more from getting more language instruction, or are they going to be okay just in Tier 1 as long as language is being scaffolded in Tier 1. So, those are the kind of more nuanced decisions that we've been making with ELLs rather than, oh, they didn't meet the benchmark, okay, Tier 2. So part of it too becomes a resource factor because oftentimes still ELLs are over-identified for Tier 2. Then finally, accuracy in identifying literacy-related disabilities. That kind of goes with the one before. Again, it's still a challenge, but again, rate of growth or lack of rate of growth seems to be a clear indicator or the best indicator for determining which children are likely to have a disability as opposed to just a language difference. So this is, again, something that we've been working on in terms of choosing linguistic appropriate measures. And part of our goal here, too, is like, how do we help schools and teachers make sure that they can monitor both students' reading growth and language? So that you can see there that in both bilingual programs or one-way or two-way dual language programs or transitional, one of the things that we recommend is to assess in both L1 and L2, in particular because they should be getting English instruction in either one of those programs, or they normally are. And so one of the things that that has worked really well in our schools is that the teachers alternate the language of the progress monitoring every other month. Here in our schools, they progress monitor. Well, it's about every 3 weeks. So they alternate the language. And so what that does is it helps them notice the growth of the students in both languages without adding to the amount of assessment or the amount of time they're spending on assessment. And it also helps them because then they can start to see different patterns of children emerge. Some children, again, the strongest children, pretty quickly by the end, sometimes even by the middle of second grade, their English and Spanish reading scores are the same. Some students, it takes them a little bit longer for the English to catch up. For the English to catch up to their Spanish, but it does. And then, you see those kids that are low in both languages. And again, that's an indication that this is a child that needs more support, right? And they're likely to have a disability if they're not making progress in either language. And, if you're doing English as a second language, then, obviously you're going to only be using English because children don't have the opportunity to learn in their first language. So again, but that rate of growth is going to be important. So other data that we have been using, or the schools have been using, looking at students' educational history, the extent of opportunity in L1 and L2. Again, I'm not sure in New York how much mobility there is or what the likelihood is that children will move from a bilingual program into an ESL program or from an ESL program into a bilingual program because different programs are offered in different schools or districts. But that's something that happens and would have an impact. And then again, looking at both their language and literacy trajectories. This is really critical. We have emerging data that tells us that, again, because we are able to get many ELLs to build those foundational skills, many times they can reach those oral reading fluency benchmarks And so we think, oh, 130 words per minute in, second grade or third grade, that's really, they're doing well. But then what happens? They take those state accountability tests and they bomb. Why? Because they haven't been developing the language that they need, right? Because the vocabulary, we all know, impacts comprehension, right? So if we're not also monitoring their language growth, then we're going to see more and more of those patterns emerge where children reach the reading benchmarks, especially like oral reading fluency, but their comprehension is going to continue to suffer because they don't have the level of language that they need to understand what they're reading. And so that will continue to be a program. And so that speaks to the relationship between language proficiency and literacy achievement. Then cut scores for measures not normed for ELLs. One of the things, again, that the districts that we've been working with is, they're using school and district comparisons, past performance, again, to try to, at their level, at their school or district level, say, okay, well, what the kids that, have this kind of trajectory end up doing okay. So we can, for our district, for our population, this is the kind of growth that leads to success. And, success can be passing your state accountability test, whatever you feel in your school or district is an important outcome. And then you can support the children that are falling below that. And usually that is more helpful in terms of planning instruction than something that won't give you the same kind of predictive validity for your area and for what you're trying to accomplish. In some cases, those benchmarks might be higher than what your other benchmarks are, right? So you won't have those children that are reading 130 words per minute and still, only having like, a 19% probability or a 29% probability of passing the state accountability test. Those children might have to read 150 words a minute in order to pass the test or to have, higher probability of passing. But you can look at your own data to help you make those kinds of decisions and then set benchmarks that will get the students where you need them to be. Because if you think 130 is going to work because that's the benchmark, and then then you quit providing support to those students, and then they don't pass. Right, and I'm not saying that passing the state accountability test should be our metric for everything we do, but it's a reality. And so we do need to make sure that students have the skills that they need. And then the class means, is another important thing. Great expectations and similar peers. It's fairly easy for teachers, especially with the help of ESL teachers, classroom teachers with the help of ESL teachers, to group kids, even if you group them, very globally into, higher language proficiency and lower language proficiency, and then look at how, their scores of those two groups differ or are the same, right? So what is the situation in your case? Because then you can address the need, right? Is it a literacy need? Is it a language need? If they have low proficiency, they're definitely going to need English in the language development. But is it impacting their scores? Sometimes very early on in first grade, when the measures are, more around phonemic awareness and word reading, kind of that level, it doesn't impact. It's only as they get older. It might impact oral fluency, but it'll definitely impact comprehension. So how do we view all this? And this is just an easy sense. Screening should include literacy levels, but also language proficiency. So every year, and you know, many states have that, have language proficiency. Again, we're trying to through writing, and this is something I'll talk more about next week, use that as a means for a quicker, easier way of getting at students' language proficiency, because it's something that's important to monitor and not easy to monitor. In terms of instruction, again, sort of the things that we have talked about, literacy skills, academic language, and then the progress monitoring in 1 or 2 languages. And then I think this is the important part in terms of exit. You know, obviously for ESL they have to be English proficiency, but you know, I think that we need to have that as a goal just as much as it's part of RTI. You know, even if kids meet that benchmark, that fluency benchmark, or you know, whatever it is, then you know, we should make sure that, I mean, we should have English proficiency benchmarks as well, and other than just exiting the program, or in addition to, I mean, I guess it's just, you know, that they should come close together. Grade level decoding and fluency, and then grade level comprehension. Again, I think so many benchmarks are around fluency, and where then we see the children struggle is with comprehension. So, you know, part of ensuring that they're ready to exit ESL is that they have grade level comprehension. So I think this went a little faster than I was anticipating. I want to, before I take your questions, I just want to direct you to this page. As part of this model demonstration of the projects, all 3 of us collaborated on these practice briefs. And you can see the topics, or some of the topics we're going to be covering. And they're available at that website. So I would encourage you to take a look at those if you haven't already seen them. So questions? There's a couple of people typing questions, so as soon as they pop up, I'll respond to them, just for the rest of you that are just kind of hanging out waiting. No, I didn't describe the pilot sites, but I can. They were in 2 states, in Texas and Colorado, in 4 different districts. The schools, one of the criterion for this project was that the schools had to have at least 40% of their population had to be ELLs. And so they had that in common. The range of percentage of students who were on free and reduced lunch range from about 70-something to 90 across the different sites. In all the sites, the majority of the ELLs were Spanish speakers. In terms of the programs, there was one-way and two-way dual language programs. There was an early transition program and an ESL program. So we actually have been implementing these practices, or thinking about how to implement RTI with ELLs across a number of different sites and different programs. So it's been quite broad. So one of the questions is if there are any specific assessments that can be recommended for the area of language development. And I mean, I think if, I'm not sure, Chantal, if you're talking about for progress monitoring or for screening. For progress monitoring, I can tell you there isn't. That's one of the reasons why we have been so interested in trying to work on developing something that might be easier to implement, using something very similar to a writing CBM, but scoring it for language development rather than just, where they comprehend and looking at spelling and syntax and those kinds of things. But in terms of language development, I mean, there's a lot of the language screeners that ESL teachers use. The idea, I think all the ones that have been around, the loss, I think a lot of, for progress monitoring, I don't think there isn't. And how can CTT most effectively be implemented for our ELLs development? I don't know what you mean by CTT. Oh, co-teaching. Well, it sort of, it depends on for the co-teaching, it depends on how much, on your resources, right? I mean, I think one of the ways that we have found to be very effective is, to use English language development or ESL as a preview review around core instruction. So, getting the children ready to participate and then helping them review. But, when we talk about instruction, too, there's a lot of things that could be used, as preview or review, things like using sentence frames, or if the teacher is going to be teaching the more advanced, academic vocabulary as part of the lesson, then ESL can prepare the children by teaching the words that they may not know, more of the Tier 1 words that the other children will know ahead of time, so that then, they can benefit from the vocabulary instruction of higher level words. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that, it depends on whether the ESL teacher's there, if they only have a certain amount of time, what most effectively can be done. Part of it, too, is to teach kids, and again, these are some of the things we'll talk about in instruction, is to teach kids strategies, right? I mean, strategies are great because it helps children be independent learners. So if the ESL teacher helps students with strategies that then they can use, to access meanings and, make sense of the Core 1 instruction, with the teacher's the classroom teacher's scaffold, that would be. So part of it will depend on what your resources are, how much time there is, the level of students' language. But that's something that, I can weave into the instructional webinar that we're going to have in a few weeks. So the other question is, what if a student is not proficient in his/her own language? Is English language intervention done simultaneously still? And I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that you're talking about a student in a bilingual program, Sharon? Because if they are in a bilingual program, I'll wait for your answer. No, Stan. Oh, yes. Okay, so if they're in a bilingual program, yes, I would still work on English language for two reasons. One is they're going to be getting instruction. If they're in a bilingual program, they're going to be getting instruction in their first language, and they're going to build that. But they also need the English instruction, and I think one of the difficulties is that if we wait too long to start English instruction for the children who need the most time, then they're always going to get behind. So at the very least, early on, they need to be getting oral language development, right? They need to start learning about English. Like I said before, that bilingual kids, even children who have learning disabilities or learning difficulties, are pretty good at developing those metalinguistic skills, at being able to separate the languages, if you will, so that they are able to differentiate between the two languages. I would maybe, if a child is having a lot of difficulty in their first language, I may not start English literacy, but I definitely do read alouds and the English language development. In the case of a student who comes to your school, and there are many of these, and they never develop literacy in their first language, whether now they're in kindergarten or third grade, for any number of reasons, refugee status, no opportunity to go to school, interrupted schooling, all those things, then then you're going to start instruction with English anyway, and those students are likely to need more support than a student that has had a rich literacy background in their first language. Maria, did that answer your question? Do you want to clarify what part you still need? Okay, thank you. Katarina? Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, I think that would apply with the for the students with interrupted formal education. And again, there's a couple of things about those students. There's a couple of things about those students. One is obviously they tend to be a little bit older. And I think with those students, more than with younger students, their rate of learning is going to be more predictive of their ability to learn, right? Many of those students are likely to be cognitively able to learn. They just haven't had opportunity, and they should learn very quickly. Other students that, have interrupted are going to have learning difficulties. Part of their learning difficulties might be due to things like, chronic malnutrition because of, whatever their status was, other kinds of trauma. So, part of those older students is that the ones that are able to learn are going to be easy to spot because anything you teach them, they're going to catch on and they're going to move on. And teaching them in English is going to be fine. They'll probably pick up, sort of the conversational English very quickly. Again, if you give them very systematic instruction in reading, they should pick that up very quickly. They'll need a lot of opportunities to use language orally and to write. That productive English is going to be critical for them because that's what they need to do. They need to develop that language. The other students that are having difficulty, you know, if they're older and are taking a long time, I would say for those students, and you're providing, again, all those things, right, the systematic instruction, a lot of the opportunities, you know, they are, and they're still not picking it up very quickly, then it's likely that they might have something else going on, you know, a difficulty, or like I said, things like around trauma. And I think with older students, even if they're just still like in third or fourth grade, motivation, you know, becomes really critical for them. It's really important for them to want to be able to learn. But, you know, the issue is that for all of these students, if there's not an opportunity for them to be in a bilingual program and English is your only option, you know, then that's what you provide, and just scaffold to the extent needed by those students. Anything else?
Oh, this is Molly. I'm going to post the survey here. There it is. If everybody could take a few minutes to complete that, we'd appreciate it. And I thank you very much, Dr. Lennon Thompson. If you could just hang on for 1 minute, I'd love to chat after.
Sure.
Audio recording for this meeting has ended.
I hope those who are still on will join us again next Wednesday.